just picking two anniversaries which I think are crucial to understand the last 90 years, the 90 years since World War I ended. And one is actually in January 1919. In January 1919, two German revolutionaries were murdered. One was Rosa Luxemburg and the other was Karl Liebknecht. And the other anniversary, which I think is crucial to understand the last 90 years, was the Wall Street crash, which happened in October 1929. Why were these two anniversaries, or why will these two anniversaries be of importance? I would argue they represent two main themes that shape pretty much the whole of the last century and still shape world politics these days. The murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht can be seen as foreshadowing the failure of the idea that socialist revolutions around the world might bring an end to oppression and exploitation, and thereby also an end to war. It did not happen, and one could argue, of course with hindsight one knows better anyways, that this murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht really is a symbol for that failure. There's another failure, and this is related to a different vision. Not the vision of socialist revolution, but the vision of liberal internationalism. Woodrow Wilson, who actually coined the term the end to end all wars, which we used as a title for our teach-in, he invented the idea of liberal internationalism, arguing there's only one way to avoid socialism around the world, and this is liberalism around the world. And he wanted to be kind of a vanguard person for that. And the Wall Street crash, Wall Street obviously was designated to be the economic heart of this worldwide liberal system. The crash on Wall Street in 1929 can be seen as foreshadowing the failure of liberal internationalism. So here we have two competing political projects, two competing political themes that shaped the 20th century and that shaped the beginnings of the 21st century too. Socialism on the one hand and liberalism on the other hand. Of course, there were other things as well during the last 90 years. Both socialism and liberalism have seen their failures. Socialism after the revolution in Russia didn't spread around the world as some activists like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht had hoped, and very quickly the socialist revolution in Russia degenerated into Stalinism in Russia. Liberalism, after the collapse of Wall Street, very quickly deteriorated into fascism. There were other things. At some point there was a kind of marriage of convenience between socialism and liberalism, kind of social liberalism, which is also known as the welfare state or welfare capitalism, and eventually both socialism and liberalism had their comebacks later in the 20th century. Socialism had a comeback in the name, or carried forward by something which then was called in the late 60s the New Left, and not very much later liberalism had a comeback in the name of neoliberalism. Well, for the last years you heard lots about neoliberalism. It seemed to be the all-prevalent theme. Free markets, privatization, low taxes, no inflation. The state has to wither away. The market rules. This is gone. And it's not long ago that it actually went down the drain. It only happened last month. Oh, 2 months ago. It happened in September 2008. The days of neoliberalism are gone. We are living in a vacuum now. Neoliberalism is gone, but we don't know where we are going. All I try to do is sketching out the current political situation, and the best way to do that is actually to understand where we come from, and this is why history is so important. And once we know where we are at, we might also be able to figure out where we actually want to go. I'm looking at 1918. That's quite obvious because the whole teaching is about what happened in 1918. I will also look at 1938. I will look at 1968. I will look at 1989. This is the only year that doesn't end on an 8. And I look at the year 2008, which we are still living in. Two of these dates, 1938 and 1989, actually make a direct reference to the events that happened in November 1918. On November 9th, 1938, there was the Kristallnacht. Nazi mobs destroying synagogues all over Germany. And they did that on the 20th anniversary of the German Revolution, which the Nazis hated by heart. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Cold War, was opened, came down, and was seen as the onset of global liberalism. Actually, in 1989, some people argued Woodrow Wilson's vision of global liberalism or liberal internationalism would come true. And it's certainly not by chance that policymakers decided to have the Kristallnacht on that day and to open the Berlin Wall on the very same day. So obviously, November 1918 really left a mark in the history of the 20th century. Now, why is 1918 so important? I already actually touched upon that. 1918 marks kind of the coming of age of two political visions. One was worldwide socialism, proletarian internationalism. In 1917, there was a revolution in Russia, and the Russian revolutionaries understood quite well Russia is weak economically and politically. If we don't get help from our friends and comrades in a more advanced country, more advanced in this sense of being economically and politically stronger than Russia, then our revolution may fail. And it was the big hope of the Russian revolutionaries that the Germans, the Austrians, the Hungarians could take on or take over what the Russians had started just a year ago. And the German revolutionaries, as much as the Austrians and the Hungarians, tried to do so. This was the vision of proletarian internationalism. And this included actually not only workers in the rich countries. Most of you will have heard the famous slogan issued by Marx and Engels, "Workers of the world unite." That slogan was amended largely thanks to the Russian revolutionaries, because Russia was a country kind of in between a modern industrial country and a backward agricultural country. This slogan was amended to "Workers of the world and oppressed peoples unite." So there was a big hope that also in the colonies people might rise up against imperial masters, against colonial powers. And this was very well understood. With hindsight, you might say, well, this can't have been a serious threat because it didn't materialize anyways. At the time, because you never know what the future brings, at the time the Russian Revolution happened, then the German Revolution started, policymakers in the West were quite concerned. And one was particularly far-sighted, and he was Woodrow Wilson. He clearly understood that the monarchies in Germany, Austria, Hungary might not be able to suppress socialist revolutions. He also was full with fear that his friends in France and Britain might not be able to contain the socialist threat sufficiently. And he also was a little bit selfish, figuring out that the idea of oppressed people of the world unite against colonialism actually might put the Americans into a position where they could take over parts of what had been colonial empires of European colonial powers before. So, in a nutshell, Woodrow Wilson's vision of liberal internationalism was to take on socialism and take over parts of the European colonial empires. He failed. Not just the revolutionaries in Germany, Austria, and Hungary failed, also kind of the bourgeois revolutionaries in the United States failed. I already mentioned it. The Soviet Union remained isolated, and that pushed the Soviet leaders onto a path of terrorist industrialization, of terrorist collectivization of agriculture, because they were simply in a situation where they had two options. One was, we either surrender, we go back to kind of colonial or inferior power, being completely dependent on Western powers, and this is what Tsarist Russia was, always being dependent on political and economic help from Western powers, or we build sufficient economic capacities to withstand the pressures from the West, because the West clearly didn't like the existence of the Soviet Union at all. They hated that. Under those conditions, the Soviet leadership decided, we give up everything we said about socialist democracy. We do everything we can to build an industrial base for our country as soon as possible. And this is how Stalinism came into this world. And clearly, this is in stark contrast to everything that socialist revolutionaries were fighting for, like in 1917 and 1918. The Russians and the German revolutionaries were not the only ones who failed, at least by the standard of their original goals. Wilson failed too. He had the idea to start a League of Nations, where, with a little bit of American leadership certainly, war could be avoided and everything could be negotiated. Not even in his home country, not even the ruling class of the United States was behind his plans. Some were, but lots were not. Moreover, and more significant certainly was that Wall Street, then, as until very recently, the heart of the capitalist world economy, as I already mentioned, it collapsed. And for that matter, money flowing out of Wall Street into the world, and if you take somebody else's money, those who send the money always have some good ideas how to use it properly. Well, once the money didn't flow anymore, people didn't listen to what Wall Street bankers and US politicians have to say. And that clearly paved the way to Hitler fascism, to the Third Reich, including allies of Hitler in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and later in Japan. And so we are in 1938. 1938 can be seen as a symbol for the failure of the socialist vision of internationalism and a symbol of failure of liberal internationalism. 1938 is the year of the last of the infamous Moscow show trials. Its most prominent victim was Nikolai Bukharin, who was the last survivor of the original kind of leadership of the Bolsheviks who had led the Russian Revolution in 1917. And in that sense, he was the last representative, the last of the guys who was a symbol of the original vision that had inspired not just the Bolshevik leadership, not just the members of the Bolshevik party, but actually workers and activists around the world. That happened in March 1938. In the same month, the Germans moved their army into Austria, and there was a fair share of the Austrian population that actually was quite happy to see the Nazis coming, or if you want to put it this way, to see Adolf Hitler, who was born in Austria, coming home. In October, the Nazis moved into Czechoslovakia. The Czech people were not happy. They were certainly Nazis, but they were a minority. A vast majority of people, Czechoslovakia was not happy to see the Nazis coming, but it was a weak country. They couldn't militarily withstand. And what had happened before was that Adolf Hitler had met the then British Prime Minister Chamberlain, and Chamberlain had told Hitler, "This is not our business. You do what you have to do." And revisionist historians actually found out that Chamberlain was not a naive guy, as he often is presented in history textbooks. He actually was pressured by Nazis in Britain. Yes, there were Nazis in Britain as much as in other Western countries, and they actually were quite happy to see the Nazis expanding. Then of course in 1938, on the November 9th, was the Kristallnacht, which made it perfectly clear to the world that the Nazis intended to remodel the world based on racist principles. They wanted to install no socialist, no liberal internationalism, a racist world order under the reign of the self-appointed white Aryan master race. And the burning and destruction of synagogues all over Germany was a symbol for that. The Nazis left no doubt where they were going to go. This means that by the end of 1938, everybody who wanted to know could know that the world was ready for another war. And there were three main players, or three main forces preparing for that war. The remaining Western liberal democracies, the United States, Britain and France, the Nazi allies, and the Soviet Union. Now, triangular relationships are quite difficult to handle. Would they all fight against each other? Would they go into coalitions? Nobody knew at the time, but pretty quickly, two of these three forces issued a pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And Western free world liberal historians, of course, are always more than willing to point out that it's not a surprise that dictatorships, red or brown, they are all the same anyways. They are kind of brothers in arms. How could they not join forces? If you look a little bit into the archives, you actually find out that Stalin, not because he was such a good guy, but because he was a pragmatic guy and wanted to save his power, had tried busily to reach an agreement with the British and the French, but they said no. And he also knew the Red Army was not prepared for a war with Nazi Germany. One of the reasons actually were the purges, which had wiped out the original leadership of the Red Army. And Stalin, because he was in charge of all that, he knew it. So to win time, he came to terms sort of with Hitler, and they signed this pact, which didn't last long. Because you can't expect Nazi leaders who consider themselves as master race and consider everybody living in Russia, be it Tsarist Russia or Soviet Russia, it doesn't matter. Russians to the white Aryan master race are subhumans. And they have to be under the control of the master race. And for that reason, the Hitler-Stalin Pact didn't last too long. In June 1948, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, and that changed the relationship between the three forces I had mentioned. Then we entered the phase where we had the anti-Hitler coalition between the Soviet Union and the Western liberal democracies against Hitler and his allies. And as you all know, the Nazis had no chance against that coalition.